Velkommen til Newspeek. Mit navn er Iben Thranholm. I morgen, torsdag den 23. juni, stemmer briterne, om de vil forlade EU eller blive. I ugevis har debatten kørt mellem ja- og nej-siden, og den har hovedsageligt handlet om økonomi, demokrati og national suverænitet, og næsten ikke om kultur, religion og immigration. Og det er påfaldende, for det er i virkeligheden, hvad det hele drejer sig om. Min gæst i dag er Gavin Ashenden, som er præst i den anglikanske kirke på Kanaløerne og præst for dronning Elizabeth. Han ønsker, at England forlader EU netop af værdimæssige årsager. Gavin Ashenden, Vicar of the Gurey in the Channel Islands and chaplain to the Queen, we're very pleased to have you here with us today on Newspeek. Thanks for taking the time. I know you are a strong supporter of Brexit. Why do you think Britain should leave the EU?
I think the most important and overriding reason has to do with democracy. In European history, we have struggled energetically to keep democratic values over the last 150 years. And it seems to me to be enormously surprising that we are allowing a European superstate to break the link between the power of those who govern them and their accountability to the people who vote in Europe. And in England in particular, in the UK, we have a very ancient democratic tradition. And one of the things that the European Community has done is it invited us to join it first of all as a trading partner, which was an excellent thing to do. And then the terms of our involvement changed subtly and without agreement to becoming a political union, but a political union without accountability. And that's something that must be resisted at all costs because states go wrong. States need to be held accountable for the power that they exercise. And there's no way of doing that within the European Union.
But is it only a matter of democracy? I think it also has to do with values. And following the debate, I haven't hardly heard any debaters really stressing culture, religion, immigration. Isn't that also issues that are very important here?
Yes, I think the reason you haven't heard them is because we have become a very illiterate culture. And at the moment, really, there are two very simple messages that are being presented. One, economic well-being on the one side if we stay, and the danger of untrammeled and uncontrolled immigration if we leave. But of course, those are the simplistic slogans of two different sides. It ought to be clear to people who read history that one of the things the EU is doing is becoming a vehicle for something that we might call cultural Marxism.
Cultural Marxism. Can you explain what that is?
Well, I'll do my best. One of the new ideas that has its roots in both the American and the French revolutions and then the Russian Revolution is the notion of equality. And equality became attached under Marxism to political and economic justice. But the Marxist experiment died. The economics didn't work. And in almost like a meme, like a spirit, like an idea, this notion of equality moved from the Marxist experiment into contemporary Western culture. Now, it's one thing to struggle energetically against injustice. It's completely another to try and fabricate, to genetically engineer social equality.
So you think that something has gone wrong here with the equality project?
Well, I think the whole idea, the whole attempt to impose equality on a society is in fact deeply flawed. And when we look and see the cost that's been paid for this in the past, we have to look at the French Revolution where there was enormous bloodshed, the dreadful bloodshed of the Russian Revolution, and the dreadful bloodshed of the Chinese Revolution and the Mao Zedong, 90 million casualties. Wherever you have attempted to impose equality by state control, you have the most terrible turbulence and bloodshed. It seems to me to be historical ignorance to try and go down this road.
Where do you see this bloodshed of today then?
Well, at the moment, this is an embryonic project that's developing. And for those who see it developing, we want to stop it here. It's not bloodshed at the moment, but it's certainly the cessation of free speech. So speaking from a Christian point of view, Christians are beginning to be arrested as they talk about the gospel on street corners in England because they're deemed to have offended a particular part of society. Society is part of society that is viewed in terms of power relations as requiring special defence.
So
at the moment, what we're finding is that this struggle is expressing itself in terms of the diminution of free speech.
So do you think that EU threatens Christian culture, Christian values in England?
Yes, I do. I think there is every evidence for it. It's extraordinary the way in which in England we've had some test cases about Christians wearing crosses at work, or even Christian priests giving sermons on the internet. And the Equalities Commission have attacked the Christians for their Christian values. The most obvious ones are, for example, when an Irish family business refused to bake a cake that was demanded of them by a gay campaign, and so because the gay culture is part of the protected project of the EU, when Christians say this is not part of our culture, we don't accept it, they are fined or imprisoned. This is part of the diminution of free speech and a particular slant against Christian rights. It would be interesting to see if other communities suffered from this, like the Islamic one, but they don't, because it appears to be that through a lens of power relations, Christianity has been seen to be overprivileged and must be attacked.
But
and other religions underprivileged and so defended against it.
Are you saying that there is an inequality between Christianity and Islam in UK today?
It's certainly before the law. Islam appears to be far more effectively protected by the law and the equalities law that the EU particularly stands for than Christianity does. Yes, that's absolutely clear in terms of the cases that are being brought.
But would it help Britain to leave the EU when it comes to those issues?
I think it would, partly because much of the equalities agenda is driven by EU legislation, and we can have no voice in EU legislation, at least in terms of the legislation that our own country imposes upon us. This is something that we can argue about and make our politicians accountable. But anything coming out of the European community, as you well know, the European Parliament itself has a very limited role in affecting this legislation. But certainly the people of our country, our own voters, have nothing to do with it. So yes, we need to take some of the power back in order to make our own government democratically accountable, so that we can have this conversation about equal rights in our own community.
Another issue that has been debated, at least for the last week, is immigration. I heard that 77% of the British people would like immigration to be less. So, the first part of the campaign was only about economy and national sovereignty, but not about immigration. But it seems to be a big issue also in Britain. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, although it would be fair to say that there is a generational divide. So people over 40 or 50 are much more anxious about immigration than people under 40 or 50. But essentially, the real concern is that the resources, the economic resources to build hospitals, schools, and even universities are not there to cater, and housing in particular, are not there to cater with the flood of people who have chosen to move towards Britain. And again, any normal society would want to balance its resources against the population that comes in. But under EU legislation, we have no power to do that. But that's crazy.
But I mean, do you think there is a danger of more Islamization of the British society if you stay in the EU, if you remain in the EU?
I think that the Islamification of our own society will happen anyway. I imagine the EU will make it more difficult to deal with legal issues because we are dealing with a legal system that is at one stage removed from our own. But the fact is, demographically speaking, already within 5 of our large northern cities, the majority of people under 20 are Muslim. So in a generation's time, the democratic power will be with Islam in these cities. And we know from asking questions of the Muslim community that the democratic majority favour Sharia law. So there will come a point when, for democratic reasons, there will be the local demand for Sharia law in British cities. Well, that's a real problem for people who are not Muslim.
Yeah, but it's a problem for many people around Europe. But speaking as a priest, do you think that there is a political solution to the problem of Islamization? Or what is your solution?
No, I'm not sure there is any solution at all. The only solution for me as a Christian is that as I look back over history and I see two methods by which Islam has spread. One is violence, terror, and the sword, and the other is population movement. The only way in which Christianity can slow down the growth of Islam is by inviting Muslims to come to know Jesus and to discover that Jesus is a more benign, a more inspirational figure than Muhammad to follow. That is the only weapon we have. It is love, prayer, and evangelism, and there is no other resource open to us. Certainly, politics won't provide us.
So, what you're advocating for is a change of heart, and that's what the politicians cannot do.
Well, I first of all would like equality of Christians before the law, which has been seriously undermined in the last 10 years. But once we have equality of Christians before the law, then one of the things that Christians need to do is to share the love of Christ with their Muslim neighbours. There is no other way in which to deal with the problem that we have. But one of the extraordinary phenomena at the moment is that there are stories of Muslims who are having dreams of Jesus, and large numbers of Muslims are converting who move, for example, to Germany and some to England, because they've discovered the compassion of the Christian community. But that's not enough. It's just the only solution for Christians is to bring the gospel to Muslims and to show them how much better the way of life is as a Christian than as a Muslim.
So, what is the biggest consequence if Britain leave the EU, and what is the biggest consequence if it remains?
If it leaves the EU, it begins a difficult but potentially very rich journey of beginning to reformulate our own laws and to take control and responsibility for our borders and for our economy and for our culture. We live in a much more diverse community now than we did 30 years ago, but we're still relatively peaceful, and there ought to be ways in which, if we take responsibility for our legislation and our culture, we should be able to develop a harmonious society. Many people say that by moving out of the trading bloc of the European community, we will find economic difficulty. And the answer appears to be that as we are the fifth largest economy in the world, and people will need to trade with us from their point of view, that this should be overcome. The difficulty with remaining in the EU is that the economic signs are that the EU is a very unstable place. The southern states are profoundly in debt, and there's every possibility that the whole infrastructure of the EU may collapse. But not only that, an enormous proportion of our own domestic law is set through the European community, and we have no control over it and almost no say as well. So we become effectively an undemocratic client of this superstate. And whilst there is no huge problem at the moment, the great danger is that the superstate will become less benign and more authoritarian. The equalities agenda we've experienced as Christians is just one example of that.
Gavin Ashenden, thanks for your time today. It was a pleasure, and you are welcome back anytime.
Thank you very much, Iben.
Du har set Newspeek, og mit navn er Iben Thranholm. Jeg er snart tilbage igen med nye spændende gæster og emner. I mellemtiden kan du se andre shows på vores website. Ha' det rigtig godt til vi ses igen, og husk, stå fast på din tro.